Again, it was never intended. It was just to put a human face on what I believe is discrimination. Now, here's why. Jennifer brought it up. Here's why I feel so passionately about this. See, discrimination has been consistently supported by the law. It has been institutionalized over and over and over again by the courts. You know this. Dred Scott versus Sanford, as it relates to blacks not being citizens. You know Minor versus Happersett, denying women the right to vote, a unanimous Supreme Court decision. You all know well that homosexuality just a few years ago, not that many years ago, 1986, was reinforced as illegal by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Bowers versus Hardwick decision. Illegal. Supporting the Georgia law, which is remarkable in this day and age that we would, in our lifetime, deny people the right to live their lives out loud and to codify that and institutionalize that in the Supreme Court. I feel very passionately that the Supreme Court was wrong when they denied blacks from being American citizens, yet an overwhelming majority of Americans at the time supported that denial. I feel it was immoral and wrong when the Supreme Court denied women the right to vote, yet the overwhelming majority of Americans at the time supported women not being able to vote. I think it was wrong what the court did in '86, and thank God with Lawrence versus Texas, they fixed it in 2003, even this more conservative U.S. Supreme Court, and overturned that, even though the majority of Americans opposed it. And this is a point that I want to make. The whole idea that let the people decide, and this is important, I think, for all of you as graduates. Let the people decide. 90% of Americans in the United States, this country, in 1948, when the California Supreme Court adjudicated that the ban against interracial marriage, the first court in the nation to do that, 90% of Americans disagreed with the California Supreme Court. 90% of Americans opposed interracial marriage. It wasn't until after this law school was born, which wasn't that many years ago, after this law school was born, that blacks could marry whites freely across this country. And it was, as Jennifer said, in the Loving versus the state of Virginia case that finally in 1967 that was dealt with. Do you know in 1967, 70% of Americans opposed interracial marriage? 70% in 1967 opposed interracial marriage. 96% of whites. I have two polls to back that up. I didn't say 1927 or 1937. This is 1967. And they called them then an activist court. In fact, the judge in that case, Jennifer, you may recall, said to Mr. Loving, who was sentenced to 1 year in prison or 25 years out of the state of Virginia. And the judge said the following: God, sir, this was the judge in the case, God put different races on different continents for a reason. God never wanted the races to mix. So said the judge. And so said 70% of Americans that agreed with him. I don't think many of us, maybe some of us, but I don't think many of us look back at 1967 and that U.S. Supreme Court as an activist court. The same arguments about tradition were being used then. The tradition is Protestants marrying Protestants, Catholics marrying Catholics. Remember, Protestants couldn't marry Catholics in this country. Tradition was blacks only being able to marry blacks, whites only being able to marry whites. That was tradition. How dare you destroy tradition, they said at the time. Think of the language today on the issue of same-sex marriage. It's precisely the same. It's tradition. It's the law. It's morality. God